So hopefully that puts to rest the idea that you don't need carbohydrates and there's only a couple kinds of carbohydrates and you need to avoid them and so on and so on. I mean, I think one of the primary issues in nutrition now is just this oversimplification that just makes things, as I said, so simplified they actually become dangerous.
Yeah. Oh, here. Welcome to the Crisco and Company podcast. I'm your host, Lee Crisco, MD. Today, our guest is Janice Stanger, Ph.D. She's a health and wellness expert and author of The Perfect Formula Diet. I read this book about 8 years ago, early in my plant-based journey, and I reread it again a few weeks ago. And I was just amazed by how compelling and thorough the book was. So I thought it'd be great to have her on the podcast. Dr. Stanger has worked with individuals and businesses for over 30 years, communicating the merits of a whole food plant-based diet. She has a Ph.D. in human development and aging from the University of California, San Francisco, and a MBA from the University of California, Berkeley. She's also certified in plant-based nutrition. Welcome, Dr. Stanger. Thanks for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I feel honored to have you on, having just read your book recently. And like I say, it was a great book. Maybe you can tell us, how did you stumble into the whole food plant-based lifestyle?
Well, I hadn't been that interested in nutrition, honestly, although I was always oriented to science and I love science. But my children, my two little girls, when they were preteens, decided to become vegetarian. And of course, like any mom, I was terrified they wouldn't get enough protein, they wouldn't grow, they'd get malnutrition. So I started researching nutrition, but having a PhD and spent a lot of time in methodology. I wasn't just reading the usual popular literature. I was reading textbooks, medical textbooks, nutrition, university level textbooks, published medical journals and nutrition journals. And what I quickly found out is when you get to that level of research, you find out that in terms of nutrition, everything I'd already learned my whole life was wrong. It was stood on its head. If I'd learned something was in one direction, it was 180 degrees opposite. So I started really delving into it. And the more I learned, the more excited I became and wanted to share it with other people.
So what is the answer to would they get enough protein?
Yes, because I didn't even know what protein was. I mean, I was just like, probably most people don't think about protein that much other than to think, gee, I need a lot of it and I need to get a lot of it. And then when I found out what protein actually was and the role it plays in your body and the whole complexity of the body and the fact that you don't have one kind of protein in your body, you have a million or more, everything just turned around for me. I realized the question didn't even make sense.
Yeah. I mean, I occasionally, check my protein intake on Chronometer, and I'm always in the acceptable range, if not even a little bit high at times. What about the needs of older people and athletes? Does the protein needs change at all?
Well, they change in terms of calories because basically another influence on me, just to backtrack so this is more understandable, was Dr. John McDougall. Because at the time I became whole food plant-based, I lived in Northern California, not that far from Dr. McDougall's center. And he used to speak fairly often, and I saw him speak many times. And so I learned a lot from him in terms of protein. And basically what you have to worry about, if you worry at all, is that you want to get 10% of your calories from protein, which is almost impossible not to do. And you don't have to worry about individual amino acids because all 20 amino acids comprise life on planet Earth. So if you have a living thing, like whether it's a plant or a fungi or a person or an animal or whatever it is, it's made from the same 20 amino acids. So you can't say, oh, I'm deficient in this or that amino acids. And I began to really appreciate the intelligence of our bodies in terms of, we're the product of 3.5, 4 billion years of evolution. And that's a long time to perfect something. So, we don't have to worry about these things. Certainly our ancestors who survived on the savannas for 100,000 years didn't worry about these things, and they did fine, and we're their descendants. So we really don't have to worry about it either. If you're an athlete, you're going to eat more food and you're going to get more calories, and those calories are going to have more protein. So it's going to automatically adjust. And if you're older, maybe you need less calories. And you do have to pay really better attention to the quality of your diet if you're older, because your body maybe can't process food so well, but that doesn't mean flooding your body with protein at the expense of everything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We just posted a video about a week ago about my weight training program. And, I've been doing a fairly strength-based weight training program for close to 2 years now. I've always worked out with weights, but I made it more strength-based. And Joyce bought me, a bunch of shirts, and a lot of them I just can't wear them. And that's eating entirely, they're too small, and that's eating entirely plant-based with just paying fairly loose attention to my protein intake. Every day I eat, whole grains. Every day I'm eating legumes, a variety of vegetables and fruits, and some nuts and seeds. And obviously it's enough protein to do the job. Um, so yeah, I think people perseverate about it far too much. And of course, if you look at, gorillas who are very, very genetically closely related to us, they're
Right.
eating almost entirely leaves and fruit with a few termites when they can get them. And these gorillas they'll 400 pounds and far stronger than a strong man. So it really is kind of a non-issue. So when you adopted this approach to eating, did you notice any improvements in your health and the health of your family?
Well, my kids were growing and they really didn't have health problems. They were just, healthy growing kids. And certainly their growth was not in the least bit um, hurt by our change in diet. But in terms of myself, yeah, I had been old enough at that point that I'd started accumulating the usual adult chronic diseases. And I had so much more energy once I became plant based. That was one of the things I noticed right away. My headaches went away. I used to have chronic headaches, and those just went away. My mood lifted. And another thing is I kind of grew up in a notion of cigarette smoke because my family smoked, and my lungs were really impaired pretty much my whole life by all the cigarette smoke I'd been exposed to. And so every winter I would go for months having constant ear infections and sinus infections and bronchitis, and I'd be on antibiotics for months at a time. All that went away.
Hmm. Hmm.
It just went away. I haven't had an ear infection or any of those kind of things since I became whole food plant based. And then that's been about 25 years now.
Oh,
But
wow.
before that, I constantly had those kind of issues.
Yeah, well, what I noticed is I lost a little bit of weight pretty quickly, and I wasn't really that overweight. My energy and endurance improved a lot. And
Yeah,
then, several months later, I realized that I'm not getting gastroesophageal reflux anymore. And I had a little bit of acne rosacea, around my nose here, and that just kind
yeah,
of disappeared. And occasionally I would get muscle cramps, on my hamstrings, working out or whatever. I haven't had a muscle cramp probably in about 8 years. And I suspect that's because I'm finally getting adequate, potassium and magnesium. Which of course I read a statistic recently on Dr. Greger's website about how only 1 in 6,000 people get adequate dietary potassium and consume uh, the proper amount of sodium, which most people are consuming too much.
right.
So now, one of the things that's fairly obvious when you look at these diets is they tend to be higher in carbohydrates. Why does that not cause a problem?
Well, first off, let's back up and consider macronutrients in general. I've read a lot of plant-based nutrition authors, both in terms of people who've written books, people who've done groundbreaking research. I try to stick to either university level textbooks and or, you know, articles in published journals in order to get information. And one thing I noticed is so many people focus on macronutrients, but the one who's been my guiding star, which is Dr. T. Colin Campbell, who wrote the China study, really recommends against oversimplifying nutrition. And he, worked as a professor in this area for decades and is certainly one of the pioneers of this field. And he writes about the fact that human nutrition is really too complicated for us to understand because there's tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of bioactive chemicals in our food. So, and you never really know what you're eating. That can't be measured because you could look at a USDA database, but that doesn't really tell you very much in terms of if there's hundreds of thousands of nutrients, it maybe lists 10 of them. And these all interact in very complicated ways that not only vary depending on what else you eat, how they interact varies depending on the state of your body. So if you're well rested, they might work in a different way than if you're very sleepy, or if you're sick, you have some infection, it might work in a different way than if you're well. It might work differently in the summer than in the winter. There are just so many things that influence this, and it's really beyond the scope of humans at this point to even understand it. So to concentrate on something like macronutrients, which is the most simplistic way you can look at nutrition, tells you basically nothing. And in terms of carbohydrates, they're actually necessary for the body to function. Most people don't know that, but your body cannot function. People think of carbohydrates as they're just, some source of energy, like maybe you want a carb load before you go for a run or something like that. But other than that, you really don't need carbs because you can burn fat or whatever. And also, your body turns excess proteins mostly into carbohydrates. So most people don't know that, but all the protein people go to so much problems to eat. Actually, they're eating way too much, so their body just turns the protein into sugars. And again, I'm sure 99.9% of people haven't really read enough about how their body works to understand that. But getting back to the carbs, they're actually a structural part of your body that if you don't have, you're going to die. So if you're just really limiting carbs, your body's going to really go to a great lengths to turn some of the protein, your amino acids, into sugars. And if you're fasting, it's going to take excess proteins in your body wherever it can hunt them down and turn them into sugars, because you literally can't function without them. And partly it's because red blood cells need to metabolize carbohydrates because they don't have mitochondria, so they can't burn fat. So at the very least, all the red blood cells in your body need a constant supply of sugars, or they won't carry oxygen, in which case you won't be living very long without your red blood cells carrying oxygen to all your cells. But the other thing that's just as important is that these carbohydrates bind to both proteins and to fats, or lipids, which are kind of the bigger category that fats belong to. And these are important structural parts of your body without which your body won't even function. And there's a whole branch of science, which is relatively new in nutrition. It's definitely one of the newer branches of nutrition. Is called glycobiology, that I've been just entranced with. I just love reading about glycobiology, that talks about how important this is, that without this binding of carbohydrate units to protein units, and remember, both the proteins and the carbohydrates are going to differ because there's millions, actually almost an infinite number of kind of proteins, but they don't all exist in humans. And, hundreds of thousands, if not more, kinds of carbohydrates. So how they link to each other, it's very complicated. I think that's one of the biggest problems in understanding nutrition, is that the advice you get from most people is so simplified that it's not only useless, but it becomes dangerous. And then the whole thing about vilifying carbohydrates, I feel, is very dangerous. So in glycobiology, they call carbohydrates what we would call sugar chains or carbohydrates. They call glycans just because they're
Mhm.
scientists and they can. So I want to read you a quote from one of the glycobiology textbooks that I think
Sure.
puts all this in context. This is pretty short, but this is from one of their top textbooks. It says, complex and diverse glycans, which remember just carbohydrates, appear to be ubiquitous to all cells in nature and essential to all life forms. Thus, over 3 billion years of evolution consistently generated organisms that use these molecules for many key biological roles. In this respect, glycans are no different from other major macromolecular building blocks of life, nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids, simply more rapidly evolving and complex. So hopefully that puts to rest the idea that you don't need carbohydrates and there's only a couple kinds of carbohydrates and you need to avoid them and so on and so on. I mean, I think one of the primary issues in nutrition now is just this oversimplification that just makes things, as I said, so simplified they actually become dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the one of the things that the keto, carnivore type people will say is, well, carbohydrates aren't important. Like there are no essential carbohydrates. Well, the opposite is true. They're so important that we have backup systems to make sure that we have adequate glucose levels. That they're actually, in fact, very important. They're not optional. Our body will make them if there isn't an adequate supply. So anyways, I think they've got that all backwards. And as far as the oversimplification thing, I totally agree. I mean, my overall knowledge of nutrition is minuscule compared to somebody like T. Colin Campbell, but he would rail against the idea of taking isolated concentrated nutrients. And a number of years ago, I actually did the certification in anti-aging and functional medicine, and they were big on all these supplements and whatnot. And when you think about when you take a pill, like let's say zinc or calcium or whatever, you're taking it in a concentrated form that does not exist in nature. And you get this bump in your blood levels, which is most likely to just cause havoc rather than help. Like it's been shown you take supplemental calcium. It might help your bones a little bit, but it increases your coronary artery calcification, your risk of heart disease. So it's very hard to sort of outsmart Mother Nature. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely, you can. I mean, first off, a lot of these supplements, you don't even really know what's in them. There's only a very small minority that have been lab studied to the extent you know what's in them. And then there might be contaminants in them.
Mhm.
Taking too much of something can have very unexpected side effects. It can throw off your whole body's metabolism. I mean, your body is doing like 100,000 things at once,
Mhm.
to maintain what's called homeostasis, which is like a balanced state of functioning that changes moment to moment, but it's always functional. So, like, if you think of yourself as multitasking in terms of your consciousness, your mind, you can't do that many things at once. I mean, maybe you can drive and listen to music and at the same time think about, what you're going to say in the meeting you're driving to. And, but there's a point at which your mind can't take on it. Maybe you can think about three or four things or do three or four things at once. Maybe if you're a genius, you could do five or more, but it's very limited. But you think in terms of your body is self-regulating, self-governing, and it's just at the same time, it's maintaining your temperature, it's maintaining your oxygen levels, it's maintaining the levels of every mineral and hormone and substance in your body. It's making proteins, it's degrading proteins, it's making glycoproteins, which are the carbohydrates attached to protein molecules, and it's breaking them down, and it's telling you, oops, watch out because there's a car coming from the left. So your vision's working, and all this is, you don't have to consciously think about. Your body just does it. So, if we get out of our body's way and just give it the right stuff, give it what it needs, then, there are illnesses that can knock that whole homeostasis off kilter. But for the most part, it's just going to do what it needs to do.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, well, at one point, I was kind of obsessed with supplements, and, I think I was taking, like, 40 different supplements at a over the
Wow.
course of a day, but it was just insane, And then I remember one time I took my supplements and it was just too much for my stomach, and I went and I threw up, and I just said, "This is ridiculous. I've got to stop." I mean, our supplementation program right now is really quite elegant. I mean, we're taking vitamin D, um, because, it's wintertime and our sun exposure is relatively limited through the winter. And in fact, I've actually had my vitamin D level checked at the end of the summer, um, and without taking vitamin D supplement, and it would actually be at the low end of the normal range. So I think it's justified to take a bit of vitamin D. We take vitamin B12 because we're not consuming meat. And then the third thing that we take is a little bit of kelp, because it's in a capsule to get the iodine, because we don't consume seafood. We're not consuming a lot of sea vegetables, just to make sure we get a little bit of iodine. And I think on average, it's about 100 micrograms a day or something that we're taking. Does that seem like a reasonable supplementation program? Would you include the iodine, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't take iodine, but occasionally when I think about it, I'll sprinkle a little seafood on whatever, not seafood, seaweed. I
Yeah.
usually use dulse, but sometimes I have kelp, and you can get it in kind of granulated form where you can easily sprinkle it on pretty much anything you're eating. And if you just sprinkle on a little bit, it um, is enough. And it doesn't really affect the taste that much unless you put in a lot. Like people make mock tuna salad and they might put in a lot of seaweed. And that's fine to eat occasionally. I wouldn't eat it 3 times a day
Mhm.
because you can get too much iodine too, which isn't a good thing. So
Yeah.
I haven't really looked into iodine. I don't really know what the best dose is. In terms of B12, I see anyone on a plant-based diet and anyone not on a plant-based diet should take B12 because B12 is the only vitamin that is not made by plants. Vitamin D isn't really a vitamin, it's really a hormone that your body makes when you're exposed to sun. So B12 is the only thing that's not made by plants, it's made by bacteria. And today we tend to sanitize our food. So the B12 that was in it is not going to be there. And, we sanitize our drinking water. And that's all a good thing because there's 8 billion of us on the planet now. So we got to sanitize things a little more than we did 100,000 years ago. So yeah, I use B12 too.
Mhm.
I don't use D. Occasionally, sporadically, I might take one, but then I'll forget about it for 2 months. And I don't, like I said, I use a little bit of seaweed, but that's about it. I think you're right not to take all those supplements because they just throw your body off balance. It's like
Mhm.
you're getting in your own way by giving, and again, evolution isn't stupid. We wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for successful evolution. And all our ancestors going back to the first living cell survived because the ones that died off aren't our ancestors, kind of by definition.
Right.
And they got by without supplements for, several billion years. So there's no particular reason we have to start taking them now.
Mhm. Now, of course, you're a fair bit further south than we are. Uh, do you agree that it's reasonable for us to be taking a bit of D through the winter?
I, I don't think it'll hurt you unless you take huge mega doses of it. It's fat soluble vitamins. If you take too much, it'll accumulate, which isn't good. But if you're just taking a little, I don't really see any harm in it.
Yeah. As
It's
far as
not a
far as the
vitamin.
as far as the iodine goes, like my rationale for getting the kelp, because then it's not like an isolated concentrated nutrient. It's still sort of a food. It's just in a capsule.
Yeah, exactly,
Um,
exactly, and people do that with things like ginger or garlic too, and they don't like the taste of ginger, they don't like the taste of garlic, maybe they'll take a little bit in a capsule, which I think is fine as long as you don't make a dose on it.
yeah, yeah. Well, even vitamin D, apparently there's some data showing that uh, higher doses actually are associated with weaker bones. Um, so, we usually just take about 2,000 IUs. Um, and like I say, the last time I had my level check, it was a little on the low side, but um, yeah, it's a big sea change for me to get away from taking all of those different supplements. Now, one thing that's common with people that consume a plant-based diet is they almost always, on average, have a lower body mass index. What is it about a plant-based diet that helps people stay slim?
Well, the food is just more filling and satisfying. When you eat a lot of animal foods or ultra processed foods, your body really isn't getting nutrients, and your body senses nutrients as well as calories. And it wants to get nutrients, it wants to get calories. That's what it needs to survive. And fiber, by the way, people kind of hyper focus on fiber, and certainly it's extremely important, but it's certainly not the only important component in food, given that there's, millions of bioactive components, according to Dr. Campbell. But people will hyper focus on that. So I just really don't know that we've done enough research to kind of go into all the details of how and why particular diets work. If you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, your body isn't going to send you out to get more nutrients because you're getting the nutrients you need, unless you're eating too few calories. And calories, by the way, are a very important nutrient too. In fact, I always think of all the nutrients, calories, the single most important one.
Hmm.
But in terms of losing weight, I think a lot of it is that you're just not as hungry because your body's more satisfied. And maybe people can exercise more if they feel better. And I don't think there's any one thing that can explain it, because the whole thing about how your body works is very complex, and our understanding of it is pretty rudimentary just because of the complexity of it. So I wouldn't say it's any one thing that keeps people thin, but it's been observed enough that we know it's true. And like you, I also lost some weight. That was something I hadn't mentioned before. But when I went whole food plant based, I also kind of like effortlessly lost weight. I wasn't even trying to lose weight. And in
Hmm.
fact, at that point, I was still eating some oils. Like occasionally, I was just learning how to eat plant based. Honestly, everybody goes through that transition period where I was totally vegan, but I might eat French fries or something like that,
Hmm.
or bagels, because I didn't know what else to eat, and I was still losing weight.
Yeah.
So, there's something about animal foods. Maybe it's the IGF-1. I just think we really don't understand it. I mean, IGF-1 is going to make your body want to grow, or it could be some other hormones in animal foods, for example, estrogen, which tends to make people put on weight. So, yeah, it's just something that's been observed without, I think, having a really, you know, uh, completely accurate and detailed understanding of it.
Yeah. One of the things Dr. Furman talks about is, people are eating this processed food and whatnot. And he thinks one of the big drivers of obesity is people, their bodies are trying to get those nutrients. So people just keep eating in an attempt to get those nutrients. If I can just backtrack a little bit regarding the supplementation, there's a little bit of controversy in the plant-based world about the need to take supplements of the longer chain omega-3 fatty acids. What do you think about that? Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, I think it's almost universally a bad idea. And again, it has to do with the nature of the fatty acids, the omega 3s. People don't understand what they're putting in their bodies. Now, first off, about these omega 3 tests people recommend, that measures how much omega 3 or whatever else you're measuring is circulating in your bloodstream. It doesn't measure how much your body has stored. Your body, even if you're a thin, healthy, trim person like you, still has fat stores. And it might have omega 3s in the fat stores that aren't circulating in your blood, but can be released as needed. So I don't see huge value to blood tests that measure things in a very short term. That's just a snapshot, because maybe if you measured your omega 3s the next day, they'd be completely different. But who can
Mhm,
afford to do that?
mhm, mhm.
So the other thing about omega 3s is they have a lot of double bonds. Let me backtrack a little here and explain that, which makes them chemically extremely unstable. So, what fats are, you have to kind of go back to basics to understand this, which again, I think is a lot of the reason people just don't want to be bothered understanding these details, or they don't have access to the information or whatever. So they'll just go for a simple strategy. But here's the thing. So fatty acids and the omega-3s and the omega-6s and many other fats are fatty acids, which means the backbone of them is a long chain of carbon atoms, right? So you have all these carbon atoms, 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you're looking at the essential omega-3, which is the kind you have to have with your diet, that has 18 carbon atoms, okay? So in any fat, you have these chain of carbon atoms, and carbon is like a person with 4 arms. So you have your arms that kind of go out to the side like this, and then you have your arms that kind of go backward and forward. And every carbon atom has that kind of forearm, and also it has to hold on to something with each arm. So if you got a saturated acid, each arm that's sticking out like this in the carbon is holding onto a hydrogen, and all the arms sticking out like that is holding onto the carbon next to it, except for the ones at the very end, which have some special, structure they're holding onto, which doesn't really matter for what we're talking about. So that's a completely stable, I shouldn't say completely stable, nothing's completely stable. That's a pretty stable chemical configuration, just in everyday life, it's not going to become oxidized or rancid, and you could put bacon fat in a jar, which my mother used to do, and it would become solid, and it could stay out for months and nothing would happen to it because it had this very stable, saturated structure. As soon as you begin to have the carbons lose hold of some of the hydrogens, it's like, oops, the hydrogen saw a better, friend somewhere else, and it went off for whatever reason. We don't have to get into this. The carbon just went away. Not the carbon, the hydrogen just went away. Now the carbon has to hold on to something else. Well, the carbon next to it also lost its hydrogen. So now they're holding on to each other, and it's a curved bond. It's called a double bond because there's a straight bond where they're holding on like this, but there's also a curved bond where they're holding on like that. And I actually made a model of this out of Tinker Toys once, and it's great because it shows that, where you have this double bond, it's very unstable, and the Tinker Toys tend to fall apart, and so do the fatty acids. So that's what makes oil go rancid. You have these very, very weak bonds that are easily oxidized or attacked by oxygen. The likelihood they'll go rancid is very, very high. And the more you have, the more likelihood you're going to have the rancidity, which basically means that the fat was attacked by oxygen. And, you can't necessarily detect it when it's going in your body, but certainly it can happen after you eat it. So you could ingest a fat, and after you eat it, it gets into the hot, very oxygen-rich environment in your body, and all of a sudden it becomes rancid when it didn't outside in a cooler environment that maybe had less oxygen. So what happens to these omega-3s, because they have all these double bonds, is they tend to be unstable. And I have a little note. I always keep a little cheat sheet that I kind of carry around about how much. Okay, so you've heard of omega-6s. Everybody's heard of omega-6s. So the essential omega-6, which has 18 carbons in it, has 2 double bonds. The omega-3 that has 18 carbons in it, which is the one, that one, and the omega-6 are the ones your body needs to survive. They're essential, has 3 double bonds. And then your body has enzymes that lengthen the chains. So if you get up to the omega-6 that has 20 carbons in it, that has 4 double bonds. If you get to the omega-3 that has 20 carbons in it, that's called EPA, that has 5 double bonds. If you get to DHA, which probably all your listeners have heard of, which is the omega-3 that has 22 carbons in it, that is obviously essential for our brain functioning, that has 6 double bonds. So the possibility it's going to become rancid is very high. Now, we do need a certain amount of them, obviously, or our brains aren't going to function and we're not going to be alive, but we don't need an excess amount of them. And people that take supplements, I think, tend to get an excess amount. And I think there's even MDs that don't understand the fundamental processes. So if you get these 18 carbon long fatty acids, and they have to be made longer in order to function, well, that's mostly needed at the very beginning of life. So who needs to do that is really pregnant women pregnant and
Mhm.
breastfeeding women because they have to supply these fatty acids to their babies while they're developing in the womb and right after they're born. And if they don't, the baby's um, not going to function right if it survives at all. So again, we're a product of 4 billion years of evolution. I have to keep repeating that. But nature's perfected the fact that when humans are pregnant, and I would assume this is true of other animals too, although I haven't studied the other animals, their body makes more of the enzyme that's needed to lengthen the carbon chain. So pregnant women have a much greater ability to lengthen a carbon chain and make these essential fatty acids that are needed for brain development and eye development and so on than just you and me who aren't pregnant, and we don't really need to do that. So I've heard even medical doctors say, well, maybe women don't need to take it because they can make more fatty acids, but men do because they have a harder time lengthening these 18 carbon chains to the 20 and 22 on carbon chains. But men don't need to do it
Mhm.
because they're not, nourishing the baby. So, that thing of like, oh, men need to take this and women don't, which I have heard a fairly well-known doctor who I really respect very much say that, it's not understanding, this mechanism of pregnancy that allows women to automatically provide it. I mean, how did babies survive and have functioning brains and eyes before, these fatty acid supplements were invented, which I'm guessing was in the last few decades? How
Mhm.
was that even possible? They had to be able to get it from their food.
Mhm. Now,
There-
what about if you're completely plant-based and you're not consuming fish or anything with the longer chain fatty acids? What happens then?
Well, your body makes the amount you need. In fact, I happen to have a good quote on that right here. So this is another one I like to work on. I think this one came from a journal article in Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry in 2004. And it's talking about DHA, which is the one that's best known for being in your brain. It says dietary DHA is not necessarily essential throughout life. It appears that DHA turns over very slowly. Metabolic demands for DHA appear to be very low, especially once tissue pools are sufficient. Indeed, existing metabolic levels of DHA probably represent what is appropriate for normal healthy metabolism. If DHA is not found to be synthesized to any significant degree in the studies conducted so far, perhaps this is because it's not required in significant amounts for the general population's healthy metabolism and is produced only when required. In other words, your body's multitasking and it's giving you what you need, or your ancestors going back 100,000 generations couldn't have survived if it couldn't do that. So I don't know why, humans living in 2025 all of a sudden need our supplements when our grandparents and great grandparents never even heard of these things, and they
Mhm.
certainly didn't take supplements of them. And yet they managed to have healthy children, and their children managed to have healthy children, and so on until we were
Mhm.
born. And people in other parts of the world where nobody takes omega-3 supplements, I mean, their children are born healthy and they can see and they can be, brilliant accomplishments and have very high IQs and so on without their parents ever taking any supplements of these.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
point is, what you want to do is protect your body. And when you take these um, these fatty acid supplements that have all these double bonds, you're not protecting your body. I mean, look even at flaxseed oil, if you've ever seen that. When you see flaxseed oil sold in stores, first off, it's in a dark bottle, and then it's in the back of the refrigerated section. Why is that? It's to help keep, and these are just the 18 chain ones, uh, from going rancid because it goes rancid so fast and it has a very short shelf life. And you better get it home fast and put it in the back of your refrigerator. And then the EPA and the DHA will go rancid even faster because they have a lot more double bonds than the flaxseed oil does. So I wouldn't put something like that on my body, something that could avoid going rancid only when it's in a dark jar for a short time in the back of the refrigerator, I personally wouldn't see taking, unless there's always an unless here, which is that, some people do have a clinical diagnosis where they have to take something. Like, for example, some people have anemia for whatever reason, and maybe they have to take iron.
Mhm.
Some people might not be able to go in the sun ever because they have skin cancer and they can't ever go in the sun and they have to take vitamin D. And I'm sure there's many other diagnoses where people have to take things. And that's true even if people on a whole food plant-based diet can get skin cancer and a lot of other things. I mean, being on a whole food plant-based diet does not guarantee you'll never get sick. You're going to get sick and you're not going to live to be 200. So, things are going to happen, in which case, if there's a clinical reason where it makes sense for you to take it or you have to take it, then you should take it. If you're just a normal, healthy functioning and you don't have a clinical diagnosis that justifies it, that's when I say. So I don't want anybody to take anything I'm saying as clinical advice. I'm not giving clinical advice. I'm just giving educational advice. So please keep that in mind.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your comments. And up until probably about, I don't know, 3, 4 months ago, we did take the algae-based omega-3, for the DHA and EPA. And then I looked into a little bit more and changed my mind on the whole thing. Like, for example, there's no proven cardiovascular benefit. There's been trials putting people on fish oil with no benefit in that regard. There's some theoretical thing about perhaps it'll help with brain health, but there's concerns that actually taking supplemental omega-3s increases your risk of atrial fibrillation. And I think it's either the EPA and or DHA, there's concerns that it can create a propensity towards more aggressive prostate cancer. So we're just going to stick with the basics. We eat a lot of green vegetables, have some walnuts once in a while. And I think we're probably fine. Maybe a little bit of chia or flax on our oatmeal in the morning, but we have stopped taking the supplements. And I think that thing about the instability, because they are unsaturated, therefore unstable. And who knows, some of these supplements, they may be sitting in a truck in 100-degree weather for a while, just rancidifying. So, it just kind of harkens back to try to get everything from your food whenever possible.
Exactly. Let me just add a couple things. One is that in terms of, yeah, the rancidity, but I do eat ground flax seeds, which are much more chemically stable. You should keep them in the refrigerator after you grind them. And partly I have omega-3s in mind, but partly I have in mind that it's just a good food. I mean,
Mhm.
flax seeds are like any
Mhm.
plant seed, they're a good food, like pumpkin seeds or sunflower seeds or whatever. And everyone's going to have a different nutritional composition, but it seems like flax seeds are a healthy thing to eat, and there's absolutely nothing lost by putting some ground flax seeds in your oatmeal or whatever. But in terms of my book, The Perfect Formula Diet, I was rereading it lately too, mostly because you did, Lee. I hadn't actually read it myself for a while, and I'd obviously written it. And the only thing I would change in it, the book was published in 2009, and it was very early in talking about things that people are just getting to now, like inflammation, like talking very extensively about the role of inflammation in chronic disease, which back then almost nobody was talking about. Now everybody's talking about it. But the only thing I'd really change is the section on omega-3s, because it was before I really understood the chemistry of the omega-3s and 6s. And I had read some stuff in sources I saw as credible, such as, high level textbooks that said omega-3s have an anti-inflammatory effect. And I realize now that is really not true. So that is literally the only section of the book at this point that I changed. There's things in it I would amplify maybe, or put in a different way. And now instead of being a couple hundred pages, it'd probably be 600 pages, but which wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. But that's the only thing I would actually change.
So are you saying that the omega-3s, even if they're like fresh from whole foods, are not anti-inflammatory? Is, or is it just
Well,
if they've
but
acidified?
let's distinguish the supplements from the whole foods. Omega-3s in ground flax seeds or chia seeds or walnuts or green vegetables are essential. I mean, you literally can't survive without those 18-chain omega-3s and omega-6s because your body can't make them. They require too much metabolic energy. Just like your body can't make the essential amino acids, those are only made by plants. The essential amino acids, by the way, I hate to go back to protein, but they're only made by plants. No animal can make an essential amino acid because they require too much energy to put together. And the plants get unlimited energy from sunshine, whereas we animals are always trying to conserve our energy. But getting back to your question about the supplements, I just would not take a supplement again unless I had some horrible clinical disease where it was essential that I take it.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
it's never fresh. I mean, it's always had to go through a manufacturing process if it's in a bottle.
mhm,
So
mhm,
if you buy a bottle of something, whether it was made a month ago or 6 months ago or a year ago and has a date stamped on it, that doesn't mean it hasn't developed some rancidity. And these oxidized fats will attack your cells. They're like any free radical. They'll attack your cells and they can damage your DNA and cause all kinds of havoc. So you might be saying, okay, well, studies have found that people that eat more fish are healthier. They have this health benefit, they have that health benefit. And it's not as extensive as most things think, but in developed countries like the United States, yeah, when you look at studies, you will find people that eat more fish tend to be healthier, even though fish have mercury and um, all kinds of the nanoparticles and just all kinds of pollutants in them. But it's because people have been kind of brainwashed to eat fish. So
mhm,
if you hear
mhm,
from your doctor and every newspaper article you read and your teacher and your maybe uncle who's a doctor who you respect or something like that, and all these people are telling you that fish is healthy, you gotta eat fish, fish is healthy, you gotta eat fish. Well, you're probably a health conscious person. So, in addition to eating fish, you might be doing other health conscious behaviors. You might be exercising more, you might be sleeping better, you might be more attentive to managing your stress. You might probably be in a higher socioeconomic class because, good broiled fishes and cheap fishes becoming more and more expensive food as we're overfishing the oceans and diminishing the fish supply. So there's a lot of reasons based on other lifestyle factors and your socioeconomic status, which is a huge, huge factor in health, that is going to say, okay, eating fish might be one of 100 things you do that you're trying to be attentive to your health. And now the 100 things you do, maybe the fish are not good and maybe a couple other things aren't good. So let's say 97 of the 100 things you're doing, like not smoking and all those kind of things are good and a few are bad. Well, they're going to get washed out. And when you look at this kind of statistical correlation, you're going to say, oh, well, people who eat fish are healthier. I want to eat fish, but you haven't looked at their whole lifestyle. And again, that's very hard to measure because statisticians will try to correct for all these things like maybe, and I'm just making this up, maybe they found, okay, people who eat fish are less likely to smoke. And so we're going to control for the fact they don't smoke. And we're going to control for the fact that they are better educated, et cetera, all these things that have strong correlations to health. But you can't statistically correct for everything. It's a very, very imperfect process. So what you end up with is eating fish looking healthy. And whereas if you had two identical people, like identical twins that did everything exactly the same, had exactly the same lifestyle, exactly the same genetics, had exactly the same jobs and everything else, and one ate fish and one didn't, I think you would find something different. But again, that kind of study's never been done. There's been a lot of kinds of important studies we want to see done that haven't been done. So there's a lot of things I think we need to talk about kind of tentatively, kind of like, this is what it would seem is reasonable, but we've got to do a lot more studies. No one study is ever definitive. You can't just say, oh, well, there was a study that showed this is good. Well, there's a lot of problems with doing these studies. So
Yeah.
maybe we need 10 or 20 studies before we really start believing it.
Yeah, yeah. No, we've had similar thoughts about the whole thing. I haven't eaten any fish since I went whole food plant-based about 8 years ago. I'm worried about the, organic pollutants and the heavy metals and the TMAO. That's another thing, cardiovascular
Yeah,
risk factor. Plus
exactly.
it's animal protein, which Dr. Campbell makes the argument that is potentially carcinogenic, too high in methionine. Um, uh, the other thing, the other important question is, you may say that, well, fish seems to be healthy. People that eat fish do a little bit better. But the question is, compared to what? I mean, if you compare it
Yeah.
to, beans and brown rice, I think the beans and brown rice definitively is going to be way more healthy than the fish. But so we talk to people fairly frequently about, diet and, uh, one response we often get is, "Oh yeah, but I eat grass-fed beef, and so that's super healthy." What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first off, in terms of ecology, because a lot of times when people take the grass-fed beef thing, they're thinking it's regenerative agriculture and they're preserving the earth and all. But actually, uh, studies have shown that grass-fed beef actually contribute more carbon to the air than uh, the grain-fed beef because they take so much longer to reach the weight at which they'll be killed and sent to the slaughterhouse. So they're out there eating this grass for a much longer period than it would take to fatten them up if you just gave them something that was more calorie dense, like say corn or soy is obviously more calorie dense than grass, which would be like kale. You'd have to eat a lot of kale to get the same calories as you would in, a bowl of lentils or a bowl of soybeans or something like that. So it takes them longer to get up to the weight at which it's economically profitable to, turn them into hamburger. So that results in more carbon being passed into the atmosphere. Also, in terms of everything we talked about, in terms of the pollutants, because these airborne pollutants get on grass, and then even in the middle of nowhere, the cows are eating grass. There's still a lot of persistent organic pollutants on it. In terms of the basic biology of their fats and their proteins and all that, and the lack of fiber and the TMAO and everything else you talked about, 100%, I agree with you, uh, are not going to change. So there's
Mhm,
no
mhm,
health benefit and there's an ecological detriment. So
mhm,
the
mhm,
grass fed beef, plus it's no better for the cows. Some people say, oh, the cows are happier or whatever. And there's just no evidence for that.
mhm, mhm. My understanding on the whole regenerative agriculture thing is it's kind of a boondoggle that there's no net benefit from a carbon point of view. And also the land use footprint is far greater for the grass-fed animals than it is for the factory farm animals. Not that I'm a fan of either. There's a issue here in sort of the Midwest, Iowa, and the Dakotas.
Yeah.
They're putting in these carbon sequestration pipelines, which I think is just kind of ludicrous, to have a mechanical system to sequester carbon. Well, the best carbon sequestrant of all is a tree or a forest.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
I mean, here we're in Iowa, everywhere you go, it's farmland. And I used to have this naive belief, oh, isn't this wonderful? We're feeding the world and whatnot. No, actually, about 85% is just going to feed animals. And that land should be, reforested. And if the world, not that it's ever going to happen, at least not in our lifetime, but if the whole world went vegan, they could reforest an area the size of Africa, right? There'd be no need for
Amazing.
carbon sequestration pipelines. But and then there's all these issues with, is this an abuse of eminent domain to put these things on people's property, et cetera, et cetera. But the whole thing would just go away if people ate more plants. It wouldn't be needed. Now, what about dairy? Does dairy have a healthy halo on it, or is it something we should avoid? What are your thoughts on dairy?
Well, dairy, first off, what you just talked about exactly about the cows, the carbon sequestration, and so on. Dairy cows mostly are fed food by that are fed by the dairy farmers.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
you have the same problem with you're using land to grow food to feed to an animal. Most of the calories and nutrients that were in that food you fed to the animal are lost because it's dissipated as heat or the cow poops it out or whatever. So you have that same issue. But in terms of dairy itself as a so-called food, and one of the most dangerous things in dairy is called IGF-1,
Mhm.
which stands for insulin-like growth factor 1, and it is closely related to insulin, but it's a growth factor that makes things grow. And we're supposed to have that early in life, like infants are growing, young children are growing, teens are growing, and they have a fair amount of IGF-1, and their bodies make it, so you don't have to eat it. And your body generates it when it needs it, just like everything else we talked about. Or, again, the human race would have died out 100,000 years ago if it didn't. So, and then it naturally decreases with age because your body isn't really growing anymore other than to, some cell regeneration. But IGF-1, which is very, very high in dairy because it's in the milk because the cow wants her calf to grow, right? So naturally, for cows to survive evolutionarily, they have to be able to grow their calves very fast. And there's a lot of IGF-1 in milk. And that makes cancer grow. So dairy is, and all this IGF-1, which is also raised by other animal foods, but it's raised most by dairy, is basically cancer fertilizer. It's fertilizer for cancer.
Mhm.
So that's one reason. Another thing is that dairy is filled with estrogen because, again, you have a pregnant cow and her levels of estrogen are high, and she's pregnant while she's being milked because she had one calf and now she's pregnant with another, but she's being milked the whole time. And pregnancy is a very high estrogen state, and a lot of the estrogen leaks into her milk. So people are drinking estrogen. So, in addition to the IGF-1, estrogen promotes reproductive cancers in both men and women. It promotes prostate cancer and breast cancer and ovarian cancer and so on. And there's nothing in it you need. I mean, in terms of the calcium, the cow did not make the calcium.
Mhm.
I mean, let's be clear on that. Cows cannot make calcium any more than they can make gold or silver or platinum. They eat the calcium. It's in the greens that they eat or whatever food the farmer's giving them.
Mhm.
And so you can get the calcium from plants just like the cow does. There's absolutely no advantage to getting your calcium from milk. It's the same mineral. Calcium is calcium is calcium. So
Mhm.
whether you're getting it from kale or you're getting it from a cow, it doesn't really matter. And again, you don't want too much calcium because, as you pointed out before, that's not very healthy either.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, the IGF-1 thing is really interesting. I read something fairly recently, and I can't remember where it was pointed out that, having excessively high IGF-1 levels even as children actually is important because girls with excessively high IGF-1 levels, which you can get from consuming dairy,
Yeah.
undergo menarche early, which is first menses, which is a well-established risk factor for breast cancer, which may, affect them, 20, 30, 40 years later. So good nutrition is important, throughout the whole life. Um, yeah, no, it's pretty fascinating. The other thing I've sort of wondered about is, from an athletic point of view, if you could make the argument that animal products are superior because you get that IGF-1 boost, which is, somewhat anabolic. But I wonder if to some degree it's just kind of a theoretical thing because you get these vegan athletes, even in the strength sports, performing at just a phenomenal level without that abnormal IGF-1 stimulation. I think that that's probably a false argument in favor of consuming meat for better athletic performance. Now, when you went through your PhD on human development and aging, and then you educated yourself, were you surprised that none of this information that you now know wasn't part of the human development and aging curriculum?
I was not just surprised, I was astonished. I was just absolutely astonished. And I was astonished because I trusted people, and I don't think anybody ever lied to me deliberately. I think they just didn't know. It's not common knowledge. All the kind of stuff we've been talking about this whole time is not common knowledge.
Mhm.
And it seemed to me it should be common knowledge. So I was astonished it wasn't. And that everything I had ever been taught, such as protein, was the most important nutrient, and you had to get lots of it, and you couldn't get too much protein, and carbs were starchy, and those weren't any good, and they made you fat, and all this kind of stuff was like 180 degrees from what was actually true. And
Mhm.
I've
Mhm.
stopped being astonished. I've kind of come to expect it, but I think other people are astonished, and it's sometimes hard for people to accept that something they've heard their entire life from dozens of people who they've really trusted and who've been right about other things and who maybe have helped them out with medical issues or other issues in their life, you know, just don't have these facts about
Mhm.
nutrition. It's very
Mhm.
sad.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I find it very, concerning, working in mainstream healthcare that almost every doctor knows nothing about this. If anything, they have the opposite of knowledge. It's like total misinformation. And the healthcare system, I think, is really part of the problem because,
Yeah.
you and I know about this stuff. It's all based on science. The average doctor has no idea, and actually would probably be kind of a bad business plan if they really made people healthy. They didn't have to come to the doctor. But I think it's a moral obligation, but they genuinely don't know. And I think what happens is, you talk to a person in the street, have a conversation or whatever, and they've never heard about it. Like, what? You're not, eating meat is not desirable. There's skepticism there because it's not validated by mainstream medicine. And I think that that kind of perpetuates the problem. So, like we're realizing at Crisco and Company that it is an uphill battle to promote this. Like we talk to people about it fairly frequently. We try to not do it in a proselytizing manner, but it's actually that minority of people that really take that information and just run with it. There was a nurse that I worked with in my previous job a few years ago. I had like a 5-minute conversation with her. She says, "Oh, what do you know about this drug about ankylosing spondylitis?" And I said, "Well, I don't know too much about that drug. I know that it, can potentially cause issues with lymphoma, and it's a big, heavy gun. But there is some reason to believe that ankylosing spondylitis is an inflammatory condition, could respond to a whole food plant-based diet." And Dr. McDougall, he's had cases where people have improved. I mean, once you have the fused joints, I mean, that's not going to get better, but the painful inflammation, the progression can be arrested. And so I had this conversation with her for about 5 minutes because she had a family member that had ankylosing spondylitis. She just ran with it. She started reading about it. Next thing you know, like she's, level 5 vegan. That was, 6, 7 years ago. She's never eaten meat since. And, her running performance has improved and so on. Um, uh, we've talked to people that have like bad heart disease, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, and there's like kind of an excuse or they don't want to do it. But like you could get totally better. I mean, you have
Right.
to break the mainstream mold of what society expects for you to eat, but the results are profound. And I think the paradox is people want the magic bullet, for their health and to look good and feel good. And it's like, well, here it is. I mean, I know that sounds like maybe overselling it, but I really think it's true. Now, it's
Yeah.
interesting. The other day, Joyce is a general aviation pilot, and she owns a small plane. And she was at the airport about a week ago, and she was getting into her car or whatever, and this guy was walking towards her, and she said, "Well, like, who is this guy?" Well, she had a conversation with him about what was it? I think it was late summer. He is diabetic, and of course, the pilots, they have to stay in good health to be able to maintain their licenses. Well, she talked a bit about diabetes, and really, it's an issue where you want to correct it by eating, a higher carbohydrate, whole food plant-based diet. And she said, read Mastering Diabetes. And then she didn't hear anything from him for months. And then this stranger is running towards, he didn't recognize him because he had lost so much weight.
Wow.
Based on that one conversation, he just ran with it, lost all this weight. His hemoglobin A1C is, it's on the way down. He's very grateful. And we've got another person we're counseling right now who was really in kind of desperate straits. She's been in and out of hospital, emergency room visits, multiple consultation with specialists, and blah, 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 blah. And so we've spent like an hour or so with her every couple of weeks, and she's feeling so much better. Lost a
Oh,
ton of weight. You know, her reflux is gone. She was on multiple proton pump inhibitors. Her generalized abdominal pain is much, much better. Her urticaria, you know, hives, chronic hives has gone away. And there was some other major thing just gone. I mean, she doesn't feel like there's a few little things that need to be tweaked just yet, but she's so much better than she was. And that's what happens when you just, you know, just embrace this thing. And not to say that there isn't a place for, you know, mainstream medical care. I mean, if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't do the job I do. I think, you know, I do some good in what I do, um, but it is frustrating. It's kind of this barrier to get through to get people to kind of, you know, accept these ideas. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I agree totally. I mean, we don't want people with the expectation that if they eat perfectly whole food, plant-based, they'll never get sick and they'll live to
Mhm.
be 200. That's not going to happen because we're
Right.
human beings and we have certain genetic constraints. At some point, everybody's going to get sick. But we can minimize that. And oftentimes we can reverse and get rid of conditions we might have had for decades, just like my sinus infections went away. You know, it just, and the headaches went away. Again, you know, your changes with age. I hate to say aging goes slower because aging is an incredibly complex process, and it's not like one thing that just like an arrow and it goes faster or slow. It's a lot of different processes that interact, but certainly the rate at which you develop health problems as you get older can certainly be greatly slowed. So I agree with you. And you know, there are people who won't have those astonishing successes. They might have something genetic going on. There might be something else in their lifestyle. They might, you know, not have access to good food. I mean, there's just a lot of other things that can go on we need to take account of. But I do feel like what you're doing is incredibly worthwhile and you're helping a lot of people, and that an incredibly high percentage of the people you're working with in this way are either going to get totally better or get 90% better.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, one thing I've noticed, you know, I graduated med school back in 1988, and I remember having this illusion, you know, as a young med student and doctor, like there's us, the doctors, and then there's the sick people. But then
Yeah.
as time goes on, you know, you get older and older. It's like, hey, you know, I'm kind of vulnerable to this stuff too. And now you know, I'm going to turn 66 in just a few weeks. Uh, you know, like I mean, you know, I have great energy. I have no major medical problems. I work out like a madman. But what's very sobering, you know, as I'm reading imaging studies all day, every day, there's these people around my age or even younger, and they've got these horrible things going on. You know, strokes and fatty liver, complications, diabetes. They're going to lose their foot. You know, they got abscess from diverticular disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And with every one of those scans, I look at them and say, this did not need to happen, you know, and that's kind of what drives me. You know, we want to make a little dent and actually have the satisfaction of like really, really helping people and preventing them from getting sick in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of satisfaction. And it sounds a lot like, you know, what Dr. McDougall always used to say when I used to hear him talk fairly often. Exactly the same thing, like how satisfying it is to be a doctor when your patients actually get well,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
just prescribing drugs to them for years on end and then having to prescribe drugs to, you know, counter the side effects of the drugs they were already taking and they're still getting worse and so on. That you've like real satisfaction that you're really helping people and seeing people get better. I
Mhm.
just think I've never been a physician, but it's just got to be an amazing feeling. And certainly I've had people, you know, I've spoken with, done presentations, so people come up to me afterward and tell me they've had amazing success going whole food plant-based.
Mhm.
And that
Mhm.
makes me feel really good too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, I frequently look into people's charts to get more information to interpret their, you know, their CAT scans or MRIs or whatever. And it's one thing that always astonished me is how many medications people are on, and how common, these things like diabetes and hypertension they're like ubiquitous. And the sad thing is, if they just go with the mainstream uh, medical advice and never meaningfully address their diet, they're never really going to get better. I mean, basically, they're just putting band-aids on the problem.
Yeah.
Um, there's a fellow that I follow on YouTube who I like. We were going to have him on the podcast. We had some technical issues. His name is Peter Rogers. He's a very brilliant doctor. He's a radiologist, and he's just got this encyclopedic knowledge about various aspects of medicine and so on. And he kind of makes the point, you go see a mainstream doctor for these things, you're never actually going to get better. But if you took a person that has an interest in health and they were to spend a week reading the sort of sources that we've learned from, they would know more about health promotion than the head of internal medicine at Harvard does, which is like a sad fact,
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
sad fact.
true. That's very true. I agree with them 100%. And we need to come up with strategies so that people understand that. I think the vast majority of doctors really do want to help their patients and are very well meaning, but they just are lacking certain knowledge. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
they need to look into things themselves and always use their kind of smell detector. Like, for example, just an example, like, why would fish be healthy? They're full of mercury, they're full
Mhm.
of persistent organic pollutants,
Mhm.
they're full of plastics, they're full of worm eggs. I mean, it just goes on and on. Like, why would they be healthy? It doesn't make any sense just because they have omega-3s that they got from eating plants, and you could just eat the plants, and the plants don't have all the problems with having food poisoning and so on, like fish do, which are a huge source of food poisoning. People just haven't really thought. Like, a lot of this, I think most people can figure out for themselves if they just get some basic knowledge and then just start thinking it through.
Mhm. Mhm. And I think, you know, one point we try to make is we believe that sort of a low fat, whole food, high carbohydrate, plant-based diet is kind of the gold standard. Not everybody's going to be willing to embrace that. But if you can think of that that as like the center of a bullseye, you want to get as close to that as possible and as close as you're willing to get. And if that message was promoted on a broad scale, you'd probably have massive improvement in the general health of the population. Um, and I think one thing people have to sort of wrestle with is like what level of compliance are they willing to stick to? Like, for example, after we're done this podcast, we're going out for dinner with some neighbors just to catch up on stuff. And, we're going to go for pizza. So Joyce and I are going to order a pizza with no cheese on it, no pepperoni, and I'll just have lots of veggies. Um, uh, is it ideal? No, there's probably gonna have too much salt in it, but like we do that once every 2 months, right? The general dietary pattern is that we're eating like 99%, whole food plant-based diet. So the one meal is not going to completely derail our health. Um, so that I mean, you have to just sort of figure out what level of compliance. I mean, I've sort of accepted that I'm going to deviate from a little bit once in a while, just in the interest of pursuing kind of a normal life. But, um, but anyway, we could probably talk forever.
Yeah.
And we've got to start getting ready. We're going out fairly shortly. I really appreciate that. And I would enjoy having you on the podcast again, because you've got just an excellent knowledge base. And so we really appreciate it.
Sure, I would love that. And enjoy your dinner. Now, in Perfect Formula Diet, I talk about, if you get 95% of your calories from whole plant foods, 5% if you're getting your eating processed foods or whatever, your body can handle that. Again, your
Mm,
body evolved to be able to handle disruptions to homeostasis and get back in balance. And some people would say that's healthy in terms of your body kind of exercises its ability to stay in balance because you disrupt it a little bit. But at the time I was researching the book, I read everything from if you're 80% whole food plant based, you're golden, up to you have to be 100%. And I figured when I looked at what I was eating and followed a fraud that I was like 95%. So I just took myself as a model. But I used to be very attentive to that. And actually, I never counted calories or measured anything like that when when I was whole food plant based. But when I was writing the book, I wanted to be able to establish a baseline. So I began measuring, like, let's say I was having some soy ice cream or something. I would actually measure how much it was and see how many calories it was and
Mm,
so on. And I figured out I was at about at 95%. And I did do that kind of measurement for quite a while, but then I haven't done it in probably at least the last 10 years, if not more, because what I found is over time, I like the healthier foods better anyway. And
mm,
sometimes you're out to eat or you're at a friend's house or something, and you just have to have something cooked in oil or has white flour or too much salt or something. And that's fine. Your body can handle that. But
mhm.
I really prefer my chocolate banana smoothie, which has 100% healthy ingredients, to an ice cream. I just like the chocolate, and it tastes much better to me now, and I can feel really good about eating. So I haven't measured in a long time,
Mhm.
and there could be weeks that go by where I eat next to nothing that would meet my standards, and other weeks, I'm traveling or something, and I have to compromise a little bit. But I don't really worry about it anymore because I've developed a trust in my body that, something like that happens, it can handle it. It's not going
Yeah,
to throw
yeah,
everything off for months at a time.
yeah. Well, a few years ago, we went on our honeymoon, and we went to this resort in Mexico. It was all plant-based. Food was really good, actually. Chef quality food. And it was funny after a little while. It's like, man, I'm really just craving my bowl of oatmeal and fruit.
Yeah.
uh,
Exactly.
or
Exactly.
just like plain steamed kale. But it is amazing. That's another important concept that I try to impart to people is that um, taste is not a static thing, right? Your taste will change, and it's not really about we eat what we like what we eat. And
Exactly.
the time will come when you really, really desire these things with no sort of guilt that you're undermining your health. But anyways, it's been awesome talking to you. I really enjoyed it and really appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed talking with you too. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe we could do it again sometime. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.